Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video, I'm going to be teaching you guys every single React hook. If you're familiar with my channel, I have a video already on this. It's actually my most successful video so far on my channel. And the reason why I wanted to remake this is because that video was made 3 years ago, and I didn't even cover every single hook. And as of 2024, a lot of new hooks were introduced. Some hooks were removed and became completely deprecated. So I wanted to make a new video on this because it seemed like a lot of you guys really enjoyed my last one. My purpose of this video is very similar to my last one, where I don't intend you to watch the entire video at once, unless you actually want to learn all the hooks at once. But rather, use this video as more of a cheat sheet. If you ever want to refine your skills or learn one specific hook that you might need for a specific use case, check the video part for that hook in this video. I obviously put timestamps on this video so you can just move around and choose the specific hook that you want to learn. And also, I'm going to not only put all of the code for this video in the description, but also I'm going to write a step-by-step version of this tutorial where you guys can just go if you want to, if you prefer text-based form. It's going to be on my website, so go to the description. It's pedrotech.co if you're interested in that as well. But yeah, that's basically it. Before we get into the video, if you could leave a like and turn on the notification bell, I would massively appreciate it, because as many of you guys might know, I'm returning back at posting videos. Never enjoyed posting videos as much as I am right now, so I would really appreciate the support that you guys can give me. So if you're interested in doing that, feel free to do so as well. So now that we're done with all of the intro, let's get into the tutorial. Okay everyone, so let's get started. Before I get into our first hook, which is going to obviously be the use state hook, the most simple hook that you can learn in React, I want to explain a little bit about how I'm going to structure this code base in case you want to just follow the examples by going to the code base in the description. How I structure this is I have this folder over here called hooks, and inside of it, we'll have the example I'm using in the video for each of the individual hooks, also accompanied by any files that I use for the examples. So if you're interested in just checking out the use ID example, you can click on it and go in there. But in our case, we're going to start with the use state hook. And the way this file is structured is obviously just empty in the beginning, but we'll be including them in our app component as we go through the video, just to show them on our right over here. So let's get started with the use state hook. So if you are a complete beginner in React, you definitely heard of this hook, but I feel like this tutorial might help you even if you have already used the use state hook multiple times, in the sense that I will explain to you guys right from the beginning what's the purpose of a state, why you don't directly just get the DOM elements and edit their HTML directly like you would with normal vanilla JavaScript. States are the fundamental building blocks of a React application. Now, the example I want to use for the state here is the most simple example that I believe is used for describing states, which is the idea of building a counter. So in this component over here, I'm going to put a div, which is going to wrap a p tag, so a paragraph tag, which is going to display some number, which is going to be the count. Then we want to have a button over here, which is going to interact with that number by increasing its value. So we'll say increase counter. Now, we currently have no way to store that number for the count, and we have no functions to call when you click the button. Before we create any state, let's just do it how we would normally do with a normal variable, as if you were playing around with JavaScript. I'll create a constant over here. Actually, I'll create a normal variable that can be altered, and I'll say count is equal to 0. And then I'll pass this value over here by passing count. Perfect. You see, now we see the count being 0. On this button over here, I'll create a variable called increase count. And inside of here, we're going to put some logic to increase the count and pass this increase count as the on click to this button. Perfect. Now, normally speaking, if I want to make this variable go up, right, this value go up by 1 each time, what I could technically do is do count plus or equals 1. But you'll see that this doesn't work. Now, it technically increases the value. If I were to console log over here the value of count, you'll see that in our console over here, it should technically, when I click the first time, show 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So the variable count is indeed changing. But why aren't we seeing that change over here? Well, because if you were using vanilla JavaScript, what you would do now is you would directly grab whatever p tag is displaying this number and change its value to represent the variable. But we're not doing that. We're using React, where our DOM needs to be updated and re-rendered automatically depending how the state of our application is. So this is the idea of a state. A state, in its most simplest form, is just a variable that you can create and change its value. And when its value is changed, it will automatically trigger a re-render of your page to demonstrate the new value. So how do we create one? Well, the way you do it is like this. You say const and then set an open and closing square brackets. Then you set it equal to the useState hook. It should automatically import it from React. Then we open and close parentheses, and you'll see that most hooks will look a similar way. Now, what do you put over here? Well, you put the initial value of what you want your state to be. So in this case, count starts at 0, so we can put 0 over here. But this, you could also pass an empty string if your state represents a string, or even an object if that's the case as well. So we'll keep it as 0. And what do we put inside of here? Well, with the way that the useState hook is defined, and you can look at it if you want to, this should return back inside of here two things. The first is the value of your state, which is being called, you can call it whatever you want, let's call it count. And then it is a function that you can use to alter the state. So we're going to call this set count. Usually it has this notation with set in front and then usually the name of the state. But why do we need a function to change it? Because although this count variable is actually working similar to how it was before when we were using let, you'll see that altering the value of it by just increasing it like this doesn't work, because what you have to do is use this set count function and mutate the value inside of it. So we'll replace this over here and we'll open and close parentheses to call this set count function. Now, what do I mean by mutating this value? Well, this function inside of here, it allows you to have a callback function inside of it. So a function that gives you access to the previous value of the state. So if count is 0 initially, the first time we call this prev value over here will be equal to 0. Now, if we increase it by 1, the next time prev will be equal to 1. So what we return from this function is just the new value of our state with this alteration. So when we call increase count, all we want to do is get the previous value and increase it by 1. If we wanted to decrease it, we could subtract or multiply or do whatever we want with this. But in our case, we want to just add it. And by doing this, we'll ensure that we're altering our state in the correct way and thus making React actually trigger a re-render because it is using the value of that state inside of this component. So you see now, if I keep clicking on this, it will keep increasing. Now, one cool thing that log, this thing over here, not console logging initially, we only logging. So you should assume that when I click on this button, we should see 1 because it increases by 1 and then it shows 1. But you'll see that even logging being this increase count function. So keep that in mind. If you were to do set count over here twice. Okay, everyone. Now let's go into the useEffect hook, which is the second most basic hook in React, in my opinion. So I changed a bit the app.jsx that we had before. Instead of showing the state example, I'm showing the effect one. So if you're playing around with the code base, I would ensure that you do the same. So what is the useEffect hook? Well, the useEffect is one of the most powerful hooks in React, even though it gets a lot of backlash, especially nowadays. And as a beginner, you will mostly use it for doing stuff like fetching data from an API immediately when your page renders. So what the useEffect hook does is it lets you run code after the component renders, depending on a set of circumstances. So if I had a state, for example, and I wanted to run a function every time that state changes value, I could use a use effect for that. If I wanted to run a function every time someone goes into my website for the first time or renders this page for the first time, I could use a use effect for that. Now, how is that going to look like? Well, the example I want to give to you guys is the idea of fetching data from an API immediately when you go inside of the website. Now, I'm going to be using a public API that you guys can access. It is the JSON placeholder API. It just returns fake data for users. And in this case, we're accessing data for like some posts. So like as if you're in Facebook making some posts. But the idea is that we want to go into our website over here. And when I first render the page, I want to run a function that will fetch this data and display it in my screen. Now, keep in mind, doing this inside of a use effect is one of the methods you're going to be using a use effect for the most as a beginner. But as you grow older in your React journey, you'll see that there's more effective ways of doing this kind of fetching data by using stuff like a React query, which is one of the best methods that you will probably learn later on. But let's get into actually building the use effect to do that. Well, the first thing we need to do is have a way to display that data. So I'm actually just going to display the data of the posts by creating an h1 tag over here saying posts. And below it, I want to have an unordered list, which we're going to loop through the data that we get back from this API request and display the list items for each individual post, right? So to do that, I want to create the use effect hook. Perfect. You saw it also auto imported over here. Now, the notation for the use effect hook is very simple. You call the hook always obviously inside of your component, never inside of an if statement, just like all the other hooks. And inside of here, you put a callback function that will execute whenever your use effect is supposed to. So whatever action information you put over here, like console log page rendered, you'll see that it will actually console log over here. It runs twice because of some of the inner workings of React, where it basically runs twice when you're in development, not actually in production, because of React's strict mode. But you can actually disable that. The whole idea is that it should render once. So what I want inside of this use effect is to be able to fetch some data. But there's one last thing that we have to do to make this use effect work. After this function definition over here, we have to add something else, which is a dependency list. Now, what is the dependency list? Well, like I said, you can make this use effect run every time the page renders, right? But the page may render because of multiple things. It might just render once if there's no states inside of a component like we have over here, and you should see that only displaying once, like I said, right? But if I wanted to run this use effect or this function every time another state changes its value, then I would add that state over here. We'll get to that later on in the video, but there are multiple reasons why you might want to put like data over here. You could want to console log every time a state changes its value, and you could put that state as part of the dependency list. But in the case where we only want to run this once when the page renders, we want to keep it empty like this. Now, what we want to do is we want to fetch data from the API, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say fetch, and I'm going to put the JSON placeholder API link over here. And I'm going to actually use promises in this tutorial. So I'm going to say then I'm going to say, I'm going to grab the response from this .then, and I want to turn that into its JSON format. And then I'm going to put another .then that will convert this into actual data. So I'll grab the JSON and I want to do something with that data. Right now, let's just console log that data so you guys can see. Actually, I need to do JSON. And perfect. Now you should see that we get the console log over here with all of the data from the API. But how do we display it in our component? Well, we need to use what we learned in the previous hook, which is the useState hook, and utilize a state for this, because we want to have a variable in which when its value is changed, which means whenever we're done fetching the data, we want to re-render the page to show its value. So I want to come over here and I want to create one state for the data that we get back from the API. So we'll say data and set data. And inside of this useState, we need to put an initial value. So this will return a list of posts. So the initial value for this will be an empty list. Perfect.
How to combine family, work, and hobbies while still making a good living? I know.
Now we need to change this to, instead of just console logging the JSON data, I want to set the data state to be equal to whatever list we get from the API. Perfect. Now to display this list over here, we'll delete this list item and add it back again later, but we'll just loop through this data. And for each item in this data, we want to map its value to some sort of JSX. So we'll grab the value of the post, and in this case, we'll create a list item for each of the items. And inside of this list item, you see it already shows the 100 list items that we got, but we haven't actually displayed any data from them. But inside of here, we'll literally just display the title. So I'll say item.title. Now we know it's title because we can see how the JSON data is formatted. It has a title with the actual title of the post, and the actual data updates to show that information. So this is something that we're doing without having to click any buttons, without having to do any actions. It runs when the page renders for the first time. Now, what about that dependency list that we talked about? Well, the best way I think to explain to you guys about this dependency list is to create another use effect that all I wanted to do is just console log the name Pedro. Now, what will this do? Well, I want to console log the name Pedro every time another state changes. Let's create another state over here. Let's call it something in the lines of show Pedro and set show Pedro. This will be a Boolean, so it will start as false, but it doesn't really matter because all we want to do is whenever I click on a specific button that will actually create over here in the top as the example for you guys, I want to make a toggle. I want to basically, whenever you click on this button, it will turn this state into the opposite of what it is, right? So if it's true, it will become false. If it's false, it will become true. Because I want to show you guys exactly what this use effect dependency list does. So to do that, we'll just set show Pedro, and we'll do that by setting the value of the set show Pedro equal to the opposite of what it was before. So if it's true, it'll become false. If it's false, it'll become true. Now, let's inspect element over here. We'll see the console, and we'll see that it did console log the word Pedro a couple times. In this case, it does twice. Now, why does it do twice? Well, it does on the first render of the page, it does twice on the first render, like we said, but I haven't put a dependency list over here, meaning that every time any state in this component changes its value, it will trigger this use effect. That's why it's important for you to put a dependency list, because if I want this to only render whenever this, whenever this is the first render, then we put an empty one, and you see now it's only showing twice instead of 4 times, because previously it would show twice when this page renders the first time, and then twice again when the data state is updated on this data fetching functionality over here. So what I want to do now is I want to make it such that every time I click on, all it does is,
Halo semuanya, nama saya Tanya. Are you living in Indonesia and want to work remotely?
Is just console log wrapping around all of this, but it now allows us to have access to that ref, which we then pass into a variety of reasons. If you're familiar with accessibility, you want to have your app be very accessible to everyone. So you use something like you create an ID for an input, and so you're basically prioritizing an up to deferred query. Then we can show a loading screen. So we'll say a p tag and then loading. And again, this is crucial for when you're dealing with complex operations that would benefit from reducing the cost of rendering. And it's mostly with like something like typing fast, like I'm trying to do right here, but it will actually not make you run into issues where it's taking a lot of time to filter through that list. Now, you might still be wondering, how is this different from the use transition hook? Well, it differs in what it does, when to use, and how it works. Because what it does is it defers a value from propagating immediately, when the use transition hook, on the other hand, defers the state to update or render some sort of task. And then on the part of when to use, you would probably use the use defer hook whenever you're working with frequently changing values, like this input. And it just happens that the example I used for the use transition also involved typing on inputs, but the use transition is mostly used when you specifically need to render heavy UI or updating a specific state. And finally, the way you use it is different, because this will automatically delay the value. When the use transition hook, you need to specifically wrap whatever you're trying to calculate around with the start transition function. So this is one of the most useful ones, I think, from the new hooks that we have so far, together with the use transition hook. I think there are things that a lot of people probably didn't realize would really benefit them and their projects, and React is really handing that will help React in the long run. Now let's talk about the use sync now of Pokemons. Now we're going to change this hook that your component stays in sync with whatever external state you need, and this looks like this. You'll create a variable called state, and we'll create a variable called this hook. You need to pass technically two things, but you can also optionally add. We'll register a listener for any external here. I'll grab this over object, which we know has the Pokemons inside of it, and we do need to fetch the Pokemons. So we have created this fetch Pokemons function. So I'll just call it, actually I'll call it over here, the fetch Pokemons function, and we'll just have a normal use effect that we'll call it on the first render. So we'll just call it over here, and I'll put the dependency list as empty. And you'll see that this does work, and it handles everything for us. Now, the great thing about this is that any other component that needs to access this data now can just use the use sync external star hook and handle all of this automatically without having to write all of this logic every single time. Now, this is great. I haven't personally used it that much since it got released, but it's great because it keeps state management separate from component logic. It also ensures that your component is always in sync with the store, even if you're in the situation of concurrent rendering mode. And I think it's a pretty simple structure when you get used to it. Now, one thing you might be questioning yourself is, why didn't we just do all this logic inside of a context and then use the use context hook to grab that data? Well, there's a couple of things and that differ between doing that and using the use sync external store. I think it mainly differs on purpose, performance, and reactivity. So talking about the purpose.
It's 9:15. How am I already underwater?
I'm in the same boat.
I'm in an actual boat.
I thought Grammarly just fixed
syncing React components with some sort of external store, whilst the use context hook and creating a context, it can indeed do something because and it will avoid unnecessary re-render when the context value is reactivity, because when the store changes, if some of them don't each. I feel like in situations where global states, maybe use a global or you're using good for you. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video. This was a lot